signings for me are the only really frightening thing I do. I can't really explain why. I think the main thing is that the responsibility of writing a book as an act of service is enormous, and the most important thing is to give it back to the source of all life. So my work with you this afternoon is offering it back. I only read this book, I wrote it in 1976. I only read it 3 weeks ago. I never read my books. And I've never used a computer. And one of the things I want to bring up before I even start telling jokes or something is, as you know, language is what divides us. I think Winston Churchill said about your country and mine, although I live here since 1973, 2 great countries divided by a common language. And all my books have to be re-edited in American when they're published here. It is a very different language, but I'm bilingual, you'll be pleased to hear. And when I'm doing a book signing or seminar in Germany, the tone of my voice and where it comes from is literally completely different to Switzerland or Austria, because they think from different places. In the States, and particularly amidst the Santa Fe hugs, as I call it, which normally puts people to sleep immediately, they hug each other, but never mind. As it is, people talk about speaking from the heart. And I just want to tell you what it means to me, because it won't mean the same to you, but it does also mean the same to you. If you listen from essence, you can hear in your own language. It is as simple as that, and that's what means listening from the heart. It is not sentimental. My family has been involved with the Sufi tradition, not that I say I'm anything to do with it, but of course I am, but I don't say I am, since 1530. And the languages have changed down the road, obviously. Sir John Feild, my ancestor, was just a nutcase like me, you know. He was a very advanced mathematician. I've never even been to college, but he was the court astronomer as well to Queen Elizabeth I, who I call Queenie. And Queenie liked him quite a lot. And he said, "Queenie, I've got a map." And she said, "What's a map?" And he said, "I've got a map around the world," to Queenie. This is true. And she said, "Well, I've got a friend called Frank." That's Francis Drake, who was called Sir afterwards. And, well, of course, a map's useless without a boat. So Frank had the boat, and John Feild had the map. And Queenie wanted to be even more famous. So off went Frank, and John waited at home. There's a lot in these stories. I always teach in story form. I'm not really a writer, I'm a storyteller. It happens to be a true story, but you can listen to it on many levels. So he waited at home, because how was he going to know unless Frank got back? So eventually he did. He arrived in Devonshire, and Queenie rushed post-haste and knighted both John and Frank. So it was Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Feild. That was the outer aspect of my ancestor's life. The inner side was very inner, and he and a man called John Dee founded, it still exists, but I have nothing to do with it. I hasten to say it because many inner groups do go corrupt. He founded something called the Golden Dawn. That still exists. And that is what his inner work was. And of course, where did the knowledge of the Golden Dawn come from? Obviously from the Sufis, because this is how it works. But remember that this word Sufi started a very long time before, well, if you understand it, you could say Plato was a Sufi, except there was no word for Sufi. And if a very famous author of many books on Sufism shocked a lot of people in the world in one of his last books, he was an Orthodox Muslim, and Idris Shah, you may have heard of him. And in his book he said, and Jesus is the leader of the Sufis. Now you tell that to an Orthodox Muslim. They will understand if they do not attempt to listen logically, right? Because you can listen logically, or you can listen allegorically, or you can listen metaphysically or mystically. And I hope that you can all hear, I know you can, if you just stop trying, as we all say, listen on the mystical side of things. Explanations come later. This book, I'm very pleased to be able to offer back to the source. It's a completely true story with a white lie in it, if any of you read it or have read it. The character in it is a man called John. His real name was John of the Cook family, who founded New Zealand and so on. John was one of the greatest mystics I've ever known, and he was part of my journey. After my teacher, I called Hamid in the book, which is not his real name. He's died now, but he was one of the, what they say in French, les cachés, the hidden ones. He packed me off to Konya in Turkey, and I had to spend 12 years learning the turn before I was allowed to teach it. It's not the same as what you see people whirling round and round, actually. And then he sent me off to this one and that dervish and that master and this master, and I trotted back because I had committed myself. I knew I had no alternative for the rest of my life and afterwards, you might say. And John, I met in Tepoztlan in Mexico. He actually died in Mexico. I'm just telling you the white lie. I said he died in Wales. And the reason is, some of you who know me know this story, but it still makes me giggle. I was so naive about the first book, which has been in print 26 years now, The Last Barrier. I was so naive. I had no lawyer, no agent. I didn't try to be a writer. Somebody just said they read a letter of mine and thought it was the epilogue to a book. It's true. So I wrote the rest of it in 40 days and it became a bestseller. And it's in every language now. It's even coming out in Filipino, and it's in Farsi and Japanese. Finally, it's coming out in Turkish and all the Latin languages and so on. But it's become a bit of a legend, and it's a true story about the first steps of real commitment. I'd been involved all my life with esoteric schools since I was very small. But it was the first step of real commitment. That's once and for all sort of thing. So I was so naive, I didn't even know it was published in German. So when I went to Germany and for a book signing, I said it's the most nerve-wracking thing. I think the first or second there were 800 or 900 people, and I didn't even know I was known. And they were all looking at me as though they were going to try and follow me. Well, of course, I have a backwards-facing machine gun. I won't have that. Nobody follows me. And it was very difficult because these words, Sufi, are thrown about like Zen. They're like peanuts. But you have to dig all your life to find out the inner meaning. So I'm again asking you, because I'm going to read a bit from both books. I've never done that before in my life. I've only read both of them in the last year. To try and listen to what it is you want or need, preferably, as Hazrat Nat Khan once said, let thy wish become my desire. Maybe they should be the same thing, because then maybe you'll get an answer, but the explanation is always later. And nothing happens by chance. As you know, I met John in Tepoztlan. I'd never heard of Tepoztlan, except by intuition. But I was taking two groups of people who had first of all been trained. When I say trained, real teaching is tough. It's not easy. As I was telling a lady here earlier, with my own students, if they arrive a minute late, they're not allowed in. That's that. There's no argument about it. And in the Druids, when I first was with them, if you missed 2 classes in your life, you were never allowed back. Even if you broke a leg. It was your fault. Right? So it isn't an easy path. It's a very funny path, if you have a sense of humor. But I met John when I took a group of people to Tepoztlan. I think we were 15. In those days, it was a tiny village. Now it's part of, what you call, Cuernavaca, almost. But it was really a center for the curanderos, the healers and the brujos, with which I got into much trouble. Paddington Bear, I always put my foot in the wrong place, but I nearly got killed in that place. But there I met this man, John, who really was, he was one of the greatest men I've ever met. He had been initiated into the Mevlevi path, actually, but he denied it, and that story is in the book, but very briefly told. Very briefly told. Because his sister was still alive, I think his son still is, but I don't know where he is, I've downplayed his condition. But I'm going to tell you what his condition was in the launching of this book, purely because, as every tradition says, do not judge. And I think in my first book I said, if you judge another, you humiliate the person you judge, and you veil yourself. And it's the thing we do all day long. We judge it good, bad, and so on. And it's very hard work not to. Very hard work, and you need a lot of teaching, in my opinion. But I luckily had a wonderful, wonderful teacher. And my family, I suppose, was imbued with it. John was a wreck. He was in a wheelchair. He was dying of cancer. He drank gin as though it was going out of fashion to kill the pain. I never saw him drunk, though. He was looked after by Pablo, who was actually only spoke Huahatl. He didn't even speak Mexican. He was an Indian. He was very, very ill indeed. But he knew that he was dying. Now I'm going to challenge you. Tomorrow at the seminar, it'll be the last one I'll be doing in the foreseeable future, because we're going back to Europe, and I'm going on a 6-month retreat in the end of March in England by myself, mostly because I need to write one more book, I think. Anyway, with John, I can only say that his presence was what would influence anybody, and all you could feel was love. He woke everybody by his presence, and somehow it came into my journey, as these people come into yours, was no exceptions, to teach us something en route. And tomorrow I'm going to concentrate entirely on death, but as life, not in the way you've probably ever heard it, because I feel it's the best offering I can make at this time. I don't really like talking too much about myself unless I'm telling jokes, but there's plenty of those. But I have had a lot of surgery and a lot of illness in my life. And 2 years ago here, I broke my back. And I thought, well, there has to be good in everything. What am I, I've had so much health problems, not that I'm complaining, I'm just saying I happen to have all my life. What is there to learn from this? What is there to learn from this? And I think it was about 3 months later, when I was still in a great deal of distress. Now, I'm only talking about me for you. It's a mirror, just to help, that's all. So don't think I'm wailing or whatever. I suddenly was granted the knowledge that I was dying. The body is whatever, but it was knowledge. It is not the same as an intellectual thing saying we're all going to die. Well, sure we are. And this saying that is so thrown about by people in and out of Sufism, die before ye die. There are many, many deaths in life. Many, many, many. It is not one crash point. Whatever anybody may tell you. Anyway, I suddenly realized this, and I realized it as a total gift. And then I had one of those wonderful runbacks, flashbacks. Because in our tradition, you never do anything for yourself because it's an illusion. If you meet a dervish, which actually means threshold, by the way, not many people know that, that is the meaning of it, threshold. If you meet a dervish, he's non-existent, right? Well, how could you meet one unless you were? So have you ever met one? You see, it's like Zen, isn't it, a little bit like Zen. And I suddenly knew I was dying. And in our tradition, you never ask for knowledge for yourself or truth for yourself, because you'll only inflate the ego. And that I know because I've done it lots of times. Luckily, I had a teacher with a big pin, which let me off pop several times. But actually, if you study or learn or ask for knowledge for the sake of knowledge, for the sake of the world, for the sake of the planet, for the sake of all beings, all sentient beings, then, when the time is right, and only then, sometimes we are granted knowledge. It is a gift from the divine. The rest is merely copy. If we try and ask for truth for ourselves, well, we may disintegrate, but truth may not go on living. If you want truth for the sake of truth, which is one of the sacred holy names of God, it may be that you will come to non-existence, because that's the only way you can know truth and still remain a normal human being. What I'm going to do is, most of you have heard of Coleman Barks, have you? He's an old mate of mine. I call him Hugging Bear, and he calls me Little Bear. And we both have a terrible sense of humour and write on the email about things, and I won't quote. He's very naughty, very bad, like me. And he wrote the foreword for the new edition of The Last Barrier and To Know We're Loved. When I first met Coleman, I thought, oh no, not another one of these endless, I call it rheumatism. I do, because they've turned Rumi into a lord. It's become a quasi-religion. If only you knew what it really is like. And I say this very humbly, I was the first Westerner ever made a sheikh of the Mevlevi dervishes in 1976, I think. And I was the first person to bring the turn to the West. And in 1975, when we had the Institute for Conscious Life in Los Angeles, and nobody had ever heard of Rumi. But I had everybody up at early morning, before dawn, learning the turn. And it's not easy, it's not whirling round and round. You start with a broomstick like this, and you hold it without moving your arms for half an hour. And it hurts, right? And then you stand on one leg, etc. But this is just to get the physical thing. And then you learn the inner turn and the vortex and many, many, many things. So I had the honor and privilege to bring it to the West, and for which I'm very grateful. However, to go back to this thing about Coleman, when you meet somebody and you have been granted any knowledge, and here I'm referring, you have been granted it. This is not just intuition. It's not just some angelic thing. The angel might be wrong, quite often. It isn't. Knowledge is something which is direct knowledge of the truth, which unfolds from itself over a period of time, over a lifetime or more. I knew when I saw Coleman that he'd had a teacher, you just know. And his teacher had given him the job before he died, which he's written about in his books, actually. He'd given him the job to become the transcriber, or whatever you want to call it, but the writer for Rumi. And that's how his function. He was a professor of history, I think. How he landed up becoming doing all these translations. So anyway, he's still a great friend, and I'd just like to read you what he said. I was very honored he wrote a foreword. At the end of his answer to Job, Carl Jung tells about the two forms of the divine presence in every human being. There is the limited ego, the ordinary person with our mailbox name, the one who is tempted and succumbs, who is afraid and ambitious, discouraged and elated. Then there is the vast one, with no knowable boundaries, who is like a sky or an abyss, a fluid substance surrounding the small identity on all sides, an ocean. In the esoteric or inner tradition, whether you call it Sufi or not, it may interest you to know that although it's been kept secret, so just for few, because it takes a lot of emptiness to understand, we actually study, not intellectually, we come to know what is the substance of the soul. It is a knowing substance which can be activated. In The Last Barrier, the companionship between these two moving together takes palpable, mysterious, even hilarious form. Reshad's adventure with his teacher Hamid, that was not his real name, he's now dead, and there's a picture of him in this new book. He didn't want his photograph ever to be shown. He was never seen in public, except to his very few students. But he was a master of a very high level. And his real name was Bülent Rauf. He spoke 10 languages, and he died and is buried in Scotland. Reshad's adventure with his teacher Hamid, in its continuous unfolding, it still is a celebration of the friendship, capital F, we are. What the dervishes say if they meet another one, right? If they know he's the real one, they'll say "Hu dost." It means he, beyond he, she, it, whatever. Hu dost. He is the only friend, etc. There's an inner meaning in that. This book reminds us that we have a responsibility to explore that friendship. I like that. Isn't it? It is our joy and our deepest freedom. It is the non-doctrinal, open-hearted growing of our souls. Just to mention the memories of such beings as Bülent Rauf, Hamid in this book, Sheikh Suleiman Dedi, Sheikh Musafer, Baal Muhaddin, that was his teacher, along with Shamsi Tabriz and Jalaluddin Rumi, is a comfort in this epoch of history. Come, come, whoever you are. Ours is not a caravan of despair. It doesn't matter that you've broken your vow 1,000 times. Still come, and yet again, come. This famous invitation of Rumi's seems to have drawn Reshad to the Middle East, directed him while there, and led him back to work with consciousness and breath, evoking this version of a poem by Rumi. Every person who is in a school is given a task. Otherwise, they're worse than useless. It doesn't matter where they put the love, light, energy into carpentry or what, but it is a task in daily life, in everything you do. And each inner school or branch of the Sufis has a speciality. Ours, we don't say as a Sufi group. We have no labels. We're just called people of the way. People of the way. And my responsibility, having brought the turn to the West and all that went with it, I won't say it is all as knowledgeable as it might be now, because of course it spread everywhere. But my job was to teach the meaning of breath, which is my next book, which is called For God's Sake, Breathe. It's a jokey book. It's my full autobiography told in joke form within the teachings. So I'm starting this year, inshallah. Anyway, breath and not just breathing. What is the meaning of it? And tomorrow we will be concentrating on that. What I can do in one day is dependent upon the attention of those who come naturally. But I will do my absolute best to transmit, although in the inner tradition there is no such thing as transmission. Does anybody disagree? Good. Because there can't be, can there? Because there's only one absolute being. Right? But we can become part of the alchemy of the heart and move together in this vortex of life, yes. But this idea, I'm transmitting to you a certain energy, that'll make money, you'll want more, and you'll pay more. It isn't like that, actually. It's a very low level, and it runs out, you know. So this is a translation of one of Rumi's poems called Only Breath that dear Coleman put in the introduction. Not Christian or Jew or Muslim, not Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi or Zen, not any religion or cultural system. I am not from the East or the West, not of the ocean or up from the ground, not natural or ethereal, not composed of elements at all. I do not exist. Am not an entity in this world or the next, did not descend from Adam and Eve or any origin story. My place is the placeless, a trace of the traceless, neither body nor soul. Neither body nor soul. I belong to the beloved, have seen the two worlds as one, and that one called to know, first, last, outer, inner, only that breath-breathing human being. About what percentage of people breathe, take even one breath in a week consciously? Gurdjieff, and I was involved with that very deeply, as still am, But as he said, we are sleepwalkers, we are not awake at all. It's a question of when we want to wake up for more than anything else, we give our life to know what is the purpose of life on earth. What is the purpose of life on earth? Whether you will accept this or not, one day you will, if only on your deathbed. If you listen now, in your own language, your language, your language, your language, each individual, you and I are the purpose of life on earth. That is the purpose of life on earth, the conscious human being, which is far beyond anything that you can read in books. Because you are the Wahid Nihad, you are the unique within the unity. You are the purpose of life on earth. That is the responsibility. Only that breathing human being. And tomorrow I'm going to concentrate a great deal from the Sufi tradition and the Indian tradition, because what unfortunately is so seldom understood or even looked at is that it's all in the Quran, but hidden a lot, and it's in all the Sufi teachings, that just as Jesus is the leader of the Sufis, I can explain this if you listen. Tomorrow I won't have time today. But so the breath of a conscious human being is called Ruh Allah, which means the Spirit of God, and that is the Christ. Now that is straight Sufi teaching from Islam. How many know that? I got in terrible trouble at the sleep clinic the other day. I can't sleep for months. And so they wired me up. And oh dear, I got in such trouble. In the morning, it was this lovely lady who looked on all these scans all night, you see. She said, Reshad, how many times do you think you woke up last night? I said, I don't know, 25 or 30. I haven't slept for months. She said, sign this. I can't tell you otherwise. So I signed the paper. She said, you woke up 489 times last night. In fact, I haven't slept at all for months and months. But I was breathing as consciously as I can. And breath, it is not just breathing for healing, if you know what I mean. It's a whole wonderful thing, which will be my next book. There's not a book yet written on it. Not yet. About, because I was teaching this 35 years ago, a lot of it, which is today's physics, which they now, see as normal physics. They've got to, for example, there are 11 dimensions. Said so on Nova the other day. That's very exciting, but actually we know there's 14. If you know the breath, there are actually 14 dimensions, but it doesn't matter, does it? One is enough. Toward the end of this book, Reshad says, I no longer knew who I was or who it was that had set out on the journey. It was as though I was slowly turning inside out. What I was looking for was what was looking. This book gives a taste of that magnificent, loveliest mystery. Find and read Reshad's descriptions of how olives are made. Then sit down with a friend and these black olives, goat cheese, fresh bread, and aged wine. And that was from Coleman. And then I'm going to read you for this launching today. And again, I'm offering the book back. I'll forget all about it now. But it has to go back to source. At the end of the book, I will also say John's last words. I love you, there is nothing else. The other night, Barbara and I were watching a thing on television, and there was this, it was a movie, or was it? I can't remember. Anyway, there was this guy who was dying of AIDS in the film. You didn't know it and until later. And he was very eccentric, and he had this paintings all over the wall, and he was sort of in this derelict drug house where he lived. But actually he was keeping himself to himself, and he was dying. And one day there was a tremendous scene, and a row came, and this person broke in and talking to him, and he shouted finally, he said, don't you understand? I love you, because her husband was thinking he was in love with the what was it in the film? In America, yeah. I love you, he said, and I love your wife, and I love everybody. Because he knew he was dying. Not intellectually, but as I've been granted that experience, it's something quite extraordinary. How can you know you're dying unless you know it from something eternal? How do you know you're dying unless you know from something eternal? So here's his little... then at the beginning, Kathleen Raine, who's dead now, she died 3 years ago, I think. She's one of the greatest mystic poets in England. I knew her very well. She was involved with the inner circles too, and this is one of my favourite poems I put in. Because I love, there is an invisible way across the sky. Birds travel that way. The sun and moon and all the stars travel that path by night. Because I love, there is a river flowing all night long. Because I love, all night the river flows into my sleep. 10,000 things are sleeping in my arms, and sleeping wake, and flowing are at rest. And this is for the forward, a short one by Cohen for this book, today's book. Rumi said, inside a lover's heart there's another world, and yet another. To know where love tracks Reshad Feild's evolving love story through several more openings past his previous work, The Last Barrier. There are worlds within this phenomenal world we inhabit, and there is even agreement, more or less, on how it proceeds. Such figures as William Blake, the Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas, Rumi, Ibn Arabi, Kathleen Raine, and Reshad himself explore the shifts of attention that explain this layering. Reshad quotes them all as he shows us how the flow of spirit feels in the moment. He jogs us awake to those simultaneous events and to how the recognition of them becomes part of us. We do live in at least two worlds at once. In this book, more than in The Last Barrier, Reshad celebrates the many levels of the feminine. Sophie, Elizabeth, Noor. There are wonderful scenes. A Stonehenge morning. Sophie's singing restaurant. Sophie was actually Madame Luba. I was a singing waiter for her. It was Gurdjieff's niece. Her real name was Luba, which means love in Georgian. I knew her for many, many years, and I was a singing waiter. And whenever I could get time off, this is before I met my teacher, I used to go and help her just cut the meat and the vegetables, you know, in the little bistro in London. She said, darling, these ladies, they know nothing. My uncle, great man, but they all talk. Don't know my uncle, Gurdjieff. No. He good man, stupid man, though. And you were sort of listening and waking up and said, but you listen, darling, she said, darling, you listen. You breathe, you silly bugger. She always used to say that. In English, that's quite a well-known word. And I was with her to the day she died, and I was at her funeral. She was a Gnostic, but she never gave teachings, except she cooked you. And she cooked everybody in there. And if she didn't like you, you went out like what not off a shovel, as they say. I remember when Princess Margaret came in with her then boyfriend, Lord Tony Armstrong-Jones, I was at school with, and Lord Snowdon. And she came in this vast rolls, and I was about to sing another little folk song or something. I used to sit on the hot radiator. Ooh, it was very painful on the bum. You know, they were the old corrugated ones. I still remember it was a marvellous time in my life. And anyway, Margaret came in, and somebody came in before her and said, Luba, it's Margaret. What? What, darling? Margaret? So what? She said, and then Tony came in, I knew him, and said, Luba, she wants to be called madam. And Luba turned around and said, darling, there's only one madam in this house, that's me, get out. And they both fled. She was a great teacher. I didn't quite know I talked about Luba. Oh yes, it was mentioned. She's called Sophie in the book, anyway. Right. There are wonderful scenes, the Stonehenge morning, Sophie's singing restaurant. Within them we develop an inner sensing, the intuition that knows the mysteries often associated with the feminine. What mysteries? How patience is the key to will. What it is to die consciously, and the subtleties of the mother's breath, which is 71717. Reshad's world is full of possibility, sudden knowing, and profound enigmas, not the least of which is the love story that carries the narrative along. Actually, I don't know whether you know this quote, but the greatest enemy of love is what? I know my students, a few here. Sentimentality. It's the greatest enemy of love. And that's why I say in the teachings I give, and it takes years, about 12 years I reckon, if somebody works hard, you have to teach the senses what to do and make them your friends, not be controlled by them. That doesn't make you any less passionate. But the average person is entirely controlled by sentimentality, the results of their opinions of others, their judgments and others on them, the desire to somehow be appreciated, the desire to achieve spiritual enlightenment, which is a stupid word. It never came in. Enlightenment was pinched from the Hindus, wasn't it? It's a very strange word, if you think about it. What does it mean? What does it mean? You see it on television frequently. I mean, what does it really mean? It's something that, anyway, I won't go into it, but we're so conditioned. And so sentimentality is the greatest enemy of love. And this story, although it's a very simple story, you feel it going through, how you'll end up with nothing but love. But it's a very passionate story of a love affair. Try expounding that sentence to the mass mind movie culture. The journey of the soul and the path of return is not a sentimental journey, he reminds us. Keep this book near, along with The Last Barrier, etc. And I'm going to finish with, I was going to read more, but I already talked too much. As Barbara says, I never stop. I'm going to read you the last bits of the book. As I told those of you here at the beginning, John was a total wreck, if you wanted to judge him. Far more than being paralyzed and so on, but he was not. He was one of the most advanced, most incredible human beings I've met. And as I say, in 1973, my teacher threw me out of England. You don't say no to a teacher, by the way. I didn't want to go. He said, now you go to Canada and Mexico and the States. He didn't say come back again. So I went with the guitar, as usual. I still carry one, and a one-way ticket. And I didn't know what to do, so I went to Vancouver and started giving talks on Sheikh al-Akbar Ibn al-Arabi in the Women's Institute, what you call it? Young YWCA. And that started a whole wave, and it grew and grew and grew and grew, and then throughout the States and then Mexico. And when I was in Mexico, it was as though John had never heard of me. I'd never heard of John, and yet the moment we met, we both needed it. He'd never told anybody, this is not completely in the book, but mostly, that he'd disobeyed. He was initiated, actually, I think, in North Africa, but he, years and years before, and the result of turning against may have been he needed somebody to come along, and I happened to be the person, to embrace him in a way, to help that completion before he actually died in the physical plane. So there's a lot more in this book, and I'm not going to read just more than this.